My name's Tyler Coleman. I'm a Vice President with Sterling State Bank in Rochester, Minnesota. And this morning, on May 18th, 2020, the SBA and the U.S. Treasury have just released the application for PPP loan forgiveness. So we've been waiting for this a while. If you've received one of these loans, there's definitely been a lack of clarity on how the loan was going to be forgiven. A lot of clarification is here now because the application that you're going to be using for this forgiveness has now been released. I'm going to walk you through it in terms of what information is needed, and there's some calculations in here that seem a little difficult, but as we walk through it, you're going to see that it's putting in a lot of information, but the calculations themselves aren't that hard, and you're going to get forgiven a good portion of your loan. Okay, so you have the application in front of you now, hopefully, from the U.S. Treasury's website. And as you're looking through it, you're going to see that at the top, it's just putting in information about your business. You're going to want to make sure that your business name and address and tax ID number match those that were on your original application for your PPP loan. Then there's some information about the loan itself, including loan numbers, number of employees at the time of loan application. You're going to get that rate off of your application. Asks for employees at the time of forgiveness application, so that's right now, and you use the same calculation, but later we're going to get into full-time employee equivalents, and we'll explain that. But for right now, you basically calculate it the same way that you did when you applied, just total number of people who are working for you. Then it asks about your EIDL loan advance, if you've applied for one. That's not everybody. We're not going to touch on that today. Next is payroll schedule frequency. And you'll see why they do that in the next two things to fill in. The covered period. So most people through this whole thing have expected that your 8 weeks that you're going to have these different costs refundable or forgiven from your loan is going to start on the day that your loan was given, and then the 8 weeks following that. That is considered your covered period. So you actually fill that number in, but you do have the option, if your first payroll was a little bit after that, of actually moving those dates so that your 8 weeks, if you got your loan on April 10th and your first payroll was on April 15th, you can have your 8 weeks start on April 15th and include that payroll and then go the 8 weeks after that. So you have that option, and that's something that you can fill in there. The next question is a place to check if your loan was in excess of $2 million. You may have heard some questions about that, there's going to be increased scrutiny for companies that did get loans over $2 million, but we're not really going to touch on that. It doesn't affect too many of our customers at our small community bank. And in the long run, as long as you've been acting in good faith, it doesn't really matter if they look at it a little bit more. They're looking for those publicly traded companies or those really large companies that didn't need these loans and took them unnecessarily. So the next, we're going to get into the forgiveness calculation itself. And this is where there's a lot of paperwork explaining these things. And we really want to get into this line by line and item by item. So now comes the calculation for payroll and non-payroll costs. So what this is those items that you could spend this money on for those 8 weeks. These are the things that you expected to get forgiven because they told you could pay for these things with the loan proceeds and then they could be forgiven. So we're going to go through it line by line. Line 1 is payroll costs. And then it says in brackets, enter the amount from PPP Schedule A, line 10. So we said that we had the application itself. There's actually a Schedule A to the application. Don't get too worked up about that at this time, because really that line 10 is just a sum of your payments for your cash compensation basically to your employees, and then your employer contributions for employee health insurance, employee retirement plans, and then state and local taxes that have been assessed on employee compensation. And lastly, compensation to owners of the company. They've actually broken that out as well. But Those are the things that you were expecting to have included in there. Ideally, you've done some good accounting to show the dollars that have actually gone out to employees that have gone to those covered expenses, because those things have not changed. They could have been part of your application for the loan as well. And then the amounts that actually went to the owners. So that number should be very simple to calculate. So we're not going to add difficulty right now. So line 1, your payroll costs during the 8-week period, either immediately following when you receive the loan or as your alternative payroll covered period, the 8 weeks following that. So basically from your first payroll. So those payroll costs. So that you expected to do, that we've told everybody that's the main part of this loan, is to make sure that payroll is consistent through this time, is as high as possible, keeping people employed and keeping people paid. And that number is really going to matter, because remember again, that payroll costs are going to be the limiting factor of how this loan is forgiven. 75% of what's forgiven is going to come from payroll costs. So next, line 2, business mortgage interest payments. If you have a mortgage, you just have to show what you paid in interest on those mortgages during this 8-week period. Same for line 3, business rent or lease payments. It's going to be those rent or lease payments made in the 8-week period that you're tracking your costs. Now, one thing that I will point out, and that there will be clarification on, we have been expecting that this was for real property, but it actually talks about personal property as well. It'll be interesting to see whether they give some clarification as to whether equipment, possibly vehicles, and those types of things could be included if you've leased any of these items. Then line 4, business utility payments. So they actually do clarify, I just want to make sure that I state them correctly, because we have received some questions on what is considered a utility payment. Well, they actually list them: electricity, gas, water, transportation, which will need some clarification, telephone, and internet access. Now, with those have to have been in place before February 15th. They have to be a continuing payment of something that you had on February 15th of 2020 for your company. But those 4 items are basically your out-of-pocket expenses for that 8-week period. You're going to have to show some bank records or canceled checks or bills that you've paid. You're going to have to compile those as evidence for these amounts that have come out of your pocket. But I think this is in line with what everybody expected. So hopefully you've kept these items, these documents, so that we can very simply fill out the first 4 lines of this application. So line 5 on the application is actually a reduction in the amount that you can get forgiven. And there was indication that these things would come to play, but for this, it's actually where you've reduced the wage or salary of an individual employee or a number of individual employees by more than 25%. I don't think this is going to apply to too many people. If it does, I encourage you to look into the guidance that's included with the application, but for most people, it's not going to change anything, is my expectation. So line 6, you're just adding your lines 1 through 4, so your costs out, and then subtracting that reduction based on the calculation in the guidance on line 5 to get your new total on line 6 of what you're looking for forgiveness. So line 7 is the FTE reduction quotient. And how you get this in very simple terms is you take the total average full-time employees during your 8-week period, and you divide that by the full-time employees that you had during a period that you get to choose. And it's either the period between February 15th, 2019 and June 30th, 2019, or the average number of full-time employees you had on payroll per month between the dates of January 1st, 2020 and February 29th, 2020. Now, calculating those employees, there's a lot of information in this application about that, but simply put, you're adding up the full-time employee equivalents. So if you have one employee who worked 40 hours a week, that was they basically are one full-time employee. If you had 2 employees that worked 20 hours a week each, they would total to be 1 full-time employee. This number is going to be very important because it can affect your forgiveness more than anything else. I'll leave that calculation to you. There are some things that you can elect that even if they only worked 1 hour a week, they could actually be considered a 0.5. It's a strange aberration of this that you can either have it if you're over 40 hours, you're a 1, and if you're under 40 hours, it's a 0.5 for calculation purposes. But, and I'm sorry for how this is one of the areas that is difficult to understand, but there's also a safe harbor, what do they call it? A FTE reduction safe harbor that basically, if you get your numbers of full-time employee equivalents to the same number that it was either during that 2019 period or the 2020 period, if you get it to that number by the end of your 8-week period or prior to June 30th, you actually don't have to worry about calculating out average over time or anything like that. You basically just don't get it reduced. They want you to bring back those employees. There's more clarification on that, but basically, if you bring back to have the same number of employees that you had as you did during one of those periods, there's no reduction, there's no multiplication reduction to the amount that you're forgiven. So now you've filled in all the other lines. Lines 8, 9, and 10 are kind of titled potential forgiveness amounts. So for line 8, you take your line 6 and you multiply it by your line 7. So that's by the quotient. So that's where you want to get it to where your number of full-time employees equivalents are the same. So that's a 1. So then that's a very simple calculation. You're just putting in basically what all your costs were out. And so that's your modified total for line 8. You're just multiplying line 6 by line 7. Line 9 is your PPP loan amount. And you simply put that in. That's what the original loan amount was that you received. Line 10 is your payroll cost. So that's your line 1, going back to your line 1. You're dividing line 1 by 0.75. And what that does then is make sure that the payroll costs are at a minimum 75% of what you're forgiven. So of those 3, you're going to have 3 different numbers. Line 11 is your forgiveness amount that you're requesting. And that's as simple as going to lines 8, 9, and 10 and just copying whatever the lowest amount was. So you can imagine for some people, their total of what they could request because their payroll has actually gone up from what their calculation was for their loan amount, you're not going to get forgiven more than what your loan was. And then again, the payroll cost has to be 75% of what you're forgiven, so that's how that's calculated. So whatever's the lowest number from lines 8, 9, and 10, that's what goes into 11, and that's the amount that you're going to be applying for forgiveness under this application. So that's a lot, and I realize there could be more specificity. You're going to have other questions. There's going to be more clarification that comes out in terms of how do you prove that you've hired everybody on to the full salary that they were at before June 30th. That's going to require some clarification. It's going to require some clarification on whether equipment or vehicles or gasoline can be included in costs that you can get forgiven. These things will come out very shortly. They will come back in a form of question and answer from the SBA. But this is to give you a general idea, and it's a lot more specific than we had at any time before this as to how to calculate your forgiveness. And you have a few more weeks here to modify how you have your business and your payroll to maximize that forgiveness amount under your PPP loan. So as much of those dollars as you received in your PPP loan to begin with are going to be forgiven by the SBA. So congratulations on receiving the loan. Now that you have this, make those proper decisions, and congratulations on getting a lot of that loan forgiveness, which is really going to help your small business in these difficult times.